Another good option for deploying our code is directly to Firebase Cloud Functions. At this point, I'm going to assume that you're somewhat familiar with Firebase Cloud Functions. If not, you can check out my Firebase Cloud Functions course, which is entirely free. The nice thing about deploying to Firebase is that it's already integrated with Express, so we can set up a single Firebase Cloud Function that will take our entire Express app and deploy it as a single HTTP Cloud Function. The first thing you'll want to do is run Firebase init functions to set up a functions project with TypeScript. You'll want to use the same TypeScript config file that we used in the server for this project. Now in the functions directory, open up the package JSON, and you'll want to make sure to set the Node.js engine as version 10. And then you'll want to grab the same dependencies that we used in that project, like cores, Express, and Stripe. Now in order to use the entire API on Firebase Cloud Functions, you can copy over all the code that we wrote with the exception of the index.ts file, because we'll want to make some modifications to it for Firebase. The first thing you should know is that you'll need to set environment variables using the Cloud Functions environment setup. You can reference the documentation for that, but basically you'll reference your environment variables from this functions config namespace. Now we can use this entire codebase by simply setting up an HTTPS function, then importing the Express app that we built and using that as an argument to onRequest for the HTTP function. This allows us to port all of the code that we wrote in our server directly over to Firebase and deploy it as a Firebase Cloud Function. So that's cool, but Firebase does have one other trick up its sleeve that you may want to consider, and that is refactoring your code to callable Cloud Functions. The nice thing about callable Cloud Functions is that they automatically decode the auth token whenever a request is made, so that eliminates the need to do it manually like we did in the server with our decode JSON web token middleware. Currently, the code in our server is broken down into a series of helper functions. You'd be able to use these helper functions directly in your Firebase Cloud Functions. So this would completely eliminate the need for the API file in the server. Instead of writing API endpoints, you could create callable Cloud Functions for each of your actual needs in the front-end application. Here's an example of how we could refactor our checkout endpoint to use a callable Firebase Cloud Function. First, we import the logic to create a Stripe checkout session. Then we define a callable Cloud Function as a variable called Stripe checkout, and in the callback, it gives us access to data and context. The context contains the current user, which we can find as the auth property. If the user's not logged in, it'll be null. Now the data is passed in from the front end, like the request body in the API. So we can take the line items from that request and then pass it to our function to create a Stripe checkout session. So it's doing the same basic thing that we did in our API endpoints in the course. However, it doesn't have any authentication middleware to worry about, and it will also simplify your front-end code as well. In our React application, we set up a helper function that would set the auth token on the header of each request. With callable functions, you can use the Firebase SDK directly to make these requests, and it will do all that stuff for you automatically. So callable functions are awesome if you're tightly integrated with Firebase, and that's actually the way I do things on Fireship.io. However, the main drawback is that this code isn't very portable, so you basically have to be using Firebase on both the front end and the back end for things to work. In contrast, if you went with the Dockerized deployment, you'd be able to deploy your back end anywhere. Ultimately, it's up to you to weigh the pros and cons between these two approaches. And with that, we've reached the end of the course. I just want to say thank you for enrolling in this course and for being a pro member. I very much appreciate it and would love to get your feedback and constructive criticism on this course. So feel free to reach out and let me know what you think. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next one.